Hello, everybody. Welcome to Cylance's Operation Cleaver. This is Stuart McClure. We're going to go ahead and get things kicked off here if everybody's ready. I also have with me Brian Wallace, our senior security researcher, who basically did most of the heavy lifting on this campaign. So I'll give him a chance to go through some of the findings that we shared in the report. And I also have John Miller, our VP of Strategy at Cylance, who also has been very helpful in organizing the campaign, but also in victim notifications, etc. So without further ado, and I know we have a very short timeline here, about 30 minutes. We're going to try and keep it to it. If you have questions, though, please submit them in the chat window. That will allow us, or the Q&A window, I guess you'd also have. I don't have that, under the questions tab. Submit those questions under the questions tab, and we'll try and get to them either during or right after the broadcast at the end. We'll try and save some time. The purpose of the webinar today is to not go through in exhaustive detail the report. You should all have the report, hopefully, or have gone through it at least a little bit, but to give a little bit of Technicolor and 4D sound, if you will, and to share a little bit of the stuff that we couldn't release inside the report, and we'll explain why as we go along, because each reason is a bit different. So I'm Stuart McClure. I'm CEO and founder of Cylance, and give you a little bit of a background on this report. So let's start from the beginning here. So Operation Cleaver was really sourced out of some victims that were identified in 2012, and we went in to respond to. And as we started to get more and more victims, we started to realize a significant pattern to the victimization, including the sourcing and the targeting and the techniques and all the usual suspects. But what we weren't able to put into the report is that we also saw a lot of data that indicated evidence of data collection in Exfil as far back as 2007. And it was so significant that even though we didn't have smoking gun evidentiary proof, it was very clear to us that it was a part of this campaign. So it was something that we didn't want to put in a report necessarily, but we didn't want to not mention it here in the webinar. And we can talk about some specifics a little later. So as we said in the report, global critical infrastructure was by and large the target, pretty much around the globe, kind of almost followed the equator to a big degree. And we really do believe, and Brian and I have talked about this many times, but we feel like the window that we had into this campaign was small. It was maybe 20% of the total campaign victims and infrastructure and C2s and infections on botnets, etc.
Yeah, our access is definitely the tip of the iceberg.
Okay. So that was really concerning to us, obviously, as we started to go through this. And let's just walk through the phases now. So the first phase really was the initial compromise, how they got in, what techniques they used. And once they got in, of course, well, how did they escalate? How did they pivot? How did they exfiltrate data? What kind of persistence mechanisms did they use? We're going to talk about those. And then really, did they tee themselves up really for sabotage, for taking over physical control systems in a number of these companies to do some real damage in the physical world? And we'll talk a little bit about that too as we go along the way. So some critical discoveries, sources emanating out of Iranian net blocks. Tar Andishan seemed to be a common name that we were discovering in our attribution phases. We also found multiple references to Zhupin exploit team and Operation Cleaver, or Cleaver, the word itself. We'll explain that. Netafraz was also a hosting company that was pretty commonly attributed to these efforts, and really not as a victim, but as at least an unacknowledged participant in all of this. Tools created to check for Iranian IPs, which I thought was one of the cooler findings and indications of really what their intentions were. So why Cleaver, the name? So the internal name for the campaign we discovered, actually we had played around with a couple beforehand, including Parvez as one of the other hacker names that came out of the effort. But really it was Cleaver that seemed to come across loud and clear as the project, the campaign. So it was used in multiple instances everything from a namespace name to in a pathing of a PDB for a particular tool that was created, multiple tools actually. And so all of those led us to believe that really Cleaver was one of the clear attributions or indications of a name that they were trying to go after in all of their project development. All right, so why are we exposing it now? Now, certainly you've seen and heard of a lot of reports that go back 4, 5, 7+ years, and you could say that the people that know about these campaigns release them after all that time to do more studying, to do more analysis, to do more attribution, to help law enforcement, all that kind of stuff. And we certainly could have. There were very few people that knew about this campaign out there in our space in the IR forensic world, and we certainly could have put pause on all of it. But to be quite honest with you, as we started to learn more and more about the data that was being exfiltrated, the networks and systems that they were on, panic and anxiety started to strike us down and said that we have to get this data out to as large an audience as humanly possible to try and identify further victims and prevent further victimization. And any more waiting and research and sinkholing and hacking back or whatever it is just wasn't going to happen. Not without further victims being a part of it. And we were starting to see that almost every day, new victims coming in. So we realized we had to act fast. And what we saw, like I said, was just shocking levels of access into these organizations, into networks and systems. I mean, basically complete ownership of their entire infrastructure. Think of it as, an AMP test just gone wild, with really no one identifying and detecting them inside the organization, in large part because they were bypassing AV and bypassing signature-based detection systems, network-based detection systems, you name it. But one of the cool things that they got into was, in one organization, for example, not just, like GoDaddy creds and PayPal creds, but LastPass creds. So, your attempt at trying to get hard passwords into all of your applications, and of course you still have that one master password that you have to use in LastPass to get access to all your other passwords. Well, of course that was compromised and discovered in that one organization. So basically just about everything. And then the high potential for physical harm is what we were really concerned about. We started to see inside oil and gas and energy companies, and really in particular airlines and airports, a very deep penetration into the very physical systems that control security and control aviation were in their hands effectively, and we knew that we had to act quick. All right, so just a little bit of setting the stage for the work here that we discovered. As you probably are aware, there have been a lot of Iranian-focused efforts either as victims of attack or as victimizers. We saw it with Stuxnet and Dooku, Flame, and Gauss in terms of them being victimized. But then we started to see activity out of the Komodo hacks and the Diginotars and Shamoon. I know there's some controversy around attribution on Shamoon to Iranian actors, but we have definitely seen that attribution ourselves. There's Operation Ababil, of course, was the DDoS attacks against the financial sector. And then last year, NMCI came out, or at least was released. They didn't come out themselves. And the Wall Street Journal broke the story that they had been compromised by Iranian hackers. And then, of course, Saffron Rose and Newscaster, etc. What we started to see is in this timeline, from the moment that they were early victims to the moment that they were starting to gain access and do physical damage to hard drives and systems out there, that there was a severe thread of retaliation that was coming about. Now, not just retaliation, but then moving away from that retaliation for something more, something deeper and stronger. So we've seen as part of this just a rapid advancement of their skill set, their organizational ability for tasking and working together, and then their tools. So the impact was seen pretty much across the board around the world, and it was certainly not a U.S.-centric lead attack. They started in everywhere from, the usual big states in the U.S., but also Middle East was highly impacted and affected. from Saudi Arabia to UAE to you name it. It was pretty much around the horn there. And then in terms of Europe was also impacted. You can see a lot of the victims there in Qatar, and of course South Korea was heavily impacted. Also, I wanted to just say, in terms of industries targeted and the level of critical impact, what we tried to do with this graph was to, on a level scale, spectrum scale, talk about what the victims, who they were in terms of their industry, and then the level of access that we witnessed in the campaign. And of course, again, we probably are seeing just a quarter of the total campaign. We witnessed almost 55 different victims. You're probably talking about 150, 200 victims easy, given the scope of the campaign that we witnessed. So you can see there in terms of level of access how they got into those organizations and how deep they got. So sourcing attribution back to Iran, I mean, honestly, there are multiple reasons. Attribution for us, quite honestly, is not, it's definitely not a science. It's an art form. There are a lot of reasons to doubt attribution. Obviously, just about every darn near thing can be spoofed in the cyber world, right? Being anonymous is very simple. And even though that is true, what we've found in many campaigns over the years is that hackers are just lazy. I mean, quite honestly, they're lazy, they're arrogant, they believe they won't get caught, or they don't care if they get caught. Certainly, there's also potential, and we've considered that throughout this campaign, of framing. So a group or another country trying to frame this particular team to Iran. And so we considered all of those factors as we looked at the data and the evidence, and came up with a clear conclusion that it is an Iranian team that is focused on the critical infrastructure. So what we saw were subnets that were being used over time. They would come up and then they would go down, and they would move, but they would use the same techniques. They would use the same destination porting, source porting, everything else. There was just far too many similarities in each of these net blocks, and they were all associated with Iran, and in particular, a common name called Tar Andishan. Now, in Farsi and Persian, it means innovators and inventors, so it's somewhat of a generic term, similar to something like Sage. If you had Sage Consulting or Sage Services or whatnot, it all means the same kind of thing, so it's a little difficult to provide real attribution there. However, all of those net blocks were associated with the Yahoo address of tar.andishan. And the same phone number was present as well. Of course, now is no longer valid and live. But also we saw a lot of the infrastructure being used in Iran from a hosting company called Netafraz. And in researching that hosting company, it was clear that this was not a victim, but rather an enabler of the activities. We saw Persian hacker names pretty much throughout. There were very few Stuarts and Brians in the mix. Which could be led to framing, but it would just, in looking at the total picture, it just was clear to us it wasn't. But one of the coolest findings was what Brian found, and he'll talk a little bit more about it later, but basically the ability for their tool, they had an ASPX shell, web shell tool that required a client, of course, to connect in after the web shell was installed. And if the web shell client coming in was coming from a source IP that was sourced out of Iran, it would show them in red that they were coming from Iran, and green if they were coming from anything but Iran, meaning that they wanted to make sure that they were not being recorded in whatever logs were in between them and the ASPX web shell and the web server, that they were coming from that Iranian IP net block. Or any net block for that matter. So they would use free GeoIP to do that and move on their merry way. Also, we saw numerous metadata elements that were in Farsi, and which helped us. And then, of course, a number of Nmap scans that were performed, stored, saved, and recorded as part of their tasking, and that was also sourced to Iranian daylight time. All right, so we also saw interesting stories. If you look at iranredline.org, you'll find an interesting blog post about them being victimized, which if you look at the web logs, it's as clear as day as a brute force authentication attempt that basically brought them offline. Now, I don't know to what sustained, levels that it was performed. He doesn't really talk about it too much, but it was clear that the same sourcing and the same team or folks were doing that out of that IP address around the same time frame as well. And he drew some conclusions that we can't make, but he tracks this type of activity quite a bit. All right, so motivation, honestly, this is, again, highly speculative, but we want to make sure that we are clear that our suspicion is that this team wanted to maintain a presence in these critical infrastructure networks and systems over a long period of time to give them either negotiating power or leverage and or the ability to perform a major attack. And ISA Partners came out after Cleaver was released last week and basically said the exact same thing, that what Operation Cleaver has been good at is in lying low and carrying out most of its operations clandestinely. They have made headway into very sensitive areas where they can do a lot of damage. We do have some concerns there carrying out reconnaissance for a major attack. And that was exactly what we saw time and time again, and we knew we had to act quick. So the evolving skills, I'm going to just tee it up and then I'm going to hand it over to Brian in a second here, but what we saw was, some basic skills, good old hacking exposed style techniques, things like SQL injection, spearfishing, malware-based attacks, which, we've seen time and again from Chinese and Russians, but we haven't seen necessarily all three of those from Iranian teams, and so we knew that they were advancing their capabilities. We also saw some interesting automated pivoting and exploitation techniques. They did use some publicly available exploits like Configure, MSO 8067, and the Chi trap or Ki trap, I don't know how to pronounce it, OD, which is MSO 10015, and or MS10, I guess you shouldn't say O, but as well as custom and automated worm-like propagation mechanisms, which were really cool. And then a lot of private tools around ARP poisoning, and encryption, and credential dumping, and you name it, okay? All right, so let's talk about this. SQL injection, it was really quite simple. We saw this quite often as one of the initial vectors of attack. There were three predominant initial vectors of attack that we were witness to. The first being standard, good old-fashioned SQL injection. Nothing fancy here, using hex encoding to bypass some very rudimentary snort logs, I'm sure, or something of that nature. But basically being able to do a simple declare of a variable, set the variable, pass it in, and actually do an XP command shell, enable that XP command shell rather, so that they can do anything they want and execute anything they want. And in fact, one of the things that they would execute is a simple FTP, anonymous FTP, to one of their IPs in the net block to just make sure that they can get outbound, that they can see the new source victim, and now they can start to do their damage, upload tools, run tools, pivot, escalate, add data exfil, etc. All right, so spearfishing. Brian, I'm going to lead you to this since you discovered this one.
Okay. So let's do for the slide update here.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. So we've seen Iranian threat actors using spearfishing in the past with newscaster, but in this case they were mostly focused around attempting to get people to or tricking people with fake resume tools. The first one we saw was Easy Resume Creator Pro, which is a site that they registered and ripped off from winresume.com, which actually has a product named Easy Resume Creator Pro. What they did is they took this website and mirrored it to their own domain at easyresumecreatorpro.com. We were able to gather a lot of information from this site containing multiple instances of tiny ZBot along with different droppers with various different app usage IDs. And app usage IDs, as I'll cover later, dictate the campaign that the sample is being used for. So what they would do with Easy Resume Creator Pro is when you went to go to the download link to actually download the product, it would instead download a binded version of Tiny ZBot, which would drop and execute the Easy Resume Creator Pro installer as well as a Tiny ZBot instance.
so the resume submitter, yeah.
And then we also saw a resume submitter being created. This actually happened sequentially after the Easy Resume Creator Pro. And essentially what this resume submitter was is it actually matched a specific brand, which we probably can't disclose. It impersonated a company saying, oh, okay, this is a resume submitter. When you input your information here, instead of submitting an actual resume, you're submitting all your information into our form and then pressing submit. While this is going on, Tiny ZBot is being dropped and executed on your machine, and none of your information is actually uploaded to the target.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So they would be sending out emails saying, hey, you should submit your resume. We'd love to talk to you about a new job if you're interested.
Emails, IMs.
Yeah, of course, all the usual requisite places. And, of course, what are you going to do if you get impacted as an employee? Are you going to go to your IT guys and say, hey, by the way, I was submitting my resume for another job and I just got hacked, or I've been having problems? Of course not, right? So it definitely diminished the motivation to go and escalate if they saw anything funky or not working.
If you went out and did that, you'd have to go out and actually submit your resume to a few other places.
That's right, exactly. All right, so the tools and toys that Brian was feverishly working through for many, many weeks and months. Of course, the public tools were pretty simple. You just open up any page of Hacking Exposed and you can see it all in there. The custom tools that were private tools and designed and developed just for them, with some source code repurposing here and there, perhaps. There was a good number of code samples being borrowed off of Stack Overflow, and as well as a few tools that were actually just flat out stolen, as we saw with the exploits, where the MSOA 067, that was an exploit stolen from some Python source code, and as well as MS10 015, that was actually stolen from the original disclosure of the vulnerability. Yeah, and so one of the cooler things that I liked actually was them leveraging, Mimikatz and WCE in a kind of an automated network crawler form.
Oh, the NetC or NetCrawler?
Yeah,
We just have a blog post up about that. If you guys want to dig more into that, feel free to check that out. But essentially what it did was it utilized PSExec and multiple versions of Mimikatz in order to worm throughout the network, executing commands and dumping cache credentials.
Yeah, I love, and they use the resources area to do the different versions, right?
Yeah, they stored different versions of the malware inside of .NET resources, which they're not going to show up on a simple PE Explorer.
Right.
But if you open up in like .NET Reflector or just decompile, you can see the resources there.
Yeah, you'd see it in there. All right, so Tiny ZBot. Why don't you spend a little time on this, because I thought this was some of the more interesting advancements of their skills. They were proving that they could advance over time, and we were watching them over 2 years kind of advance this tool, and we talk about it, I know in the report, I know you do, but give kind of some nuggets here.
So Tiny ZBot was definitely their flagship bot, as far as I could tell. It was the main bot that they developed. The name presumably is based around Zeus. So even though it uses a completely different code base from Zeus, the purpose of the bot is to steal passwords and to log keystrokes. So I imagine they were looking at that as far as limited capability Zeus.
Yeah, and actually, real quick, a question came in that is relevant to this page, so I'll bring it up, which is, don't they also use PBZ-in? And wasn't that the earlier version of the Tiny ZBot?
Actually, with PBZ-in, that's the earlier version of WND test.
Oh, okay, yeah.
PBZ-in, it was much less used, but it was definitely one of their earlier bots. It was actually written in C as opposed to in C#.
Right. It was their poor man's Tiny ZBot.
Yeah, essentially, yeah.
Exactly. Okay. So sorry, go ahead, keep going, Brian.
And also functionality we see with Tiny ZBot is the ability to download and execute arbitrary code. And while many bots do have this ability, it definitely needs to be mentioned, as it could lead to further persistence or dropping of other tools. It kind of opens up the possibilities there. As I mentioned before, it can also extract saved passwords from Internet Explorer. So being able to dump those credentials, it could be anything from banking passwords to web forum passwords, everything.
Kind of credentials.
Email, as I mentioned earlier, they use a method to identify campaigns, and this is something you generally see in targeted malware as opposed to just general purpose.
Spray and pray.
And we saw a lot of these actually not using code words at all. They would just flat out say,
flat out the company name.
The company name just right there in it.
They weren't shy.
We also saw some security software detection. They were able to enumerate all of the antivirus and firewall and advanced or anti-exploitation tools available on the machine. And specifically, they had an ability to disable a Vera antivirus, given that they had the proper permissions. And this is specifically to avoid being detected on one of their key logging code bases, because they borrowed finger quotes, code for a keylogger from I believe Hack Forums was one of the first places I saw it. And they borrowed that code, which has known detections on it in a Vera, threw it in their bot, and then realized, oh, a Vera's
Vera catches us, so we got to disable Vera.
It's no longer fully undetectable.
No problem for them. And this was just good indications that they kept evolving, didn't they? I mean, like every week. Adding these capabilities inside of it, and you saw it actively being developed.
Yeah, I saw that. I was tracking this development over time. It was always exciting to see a new sample pop up. A new sample pop up on Firestone and be like, oh, where does this fit in the timeline? So based on compile time, I was able to build up a pretty in-depth history of how they went about developing Tiny ZBot, even noting that they had about a 1-year hiatus from developing it, which they probably had about 3 months of development in between, as far as the advancement went in between there.
All right, I know we're running short on time, so we'll kind of do a quick wrap up here. In terms of access and exfiltration, I mean, they had everything, like I said. There was a question about LastPass. You asked about, do I understand correctly that the LastPass master password has been cracked? Was this a one-off of instance? No, it wasn't cracked. It was literally.
Yeah, someone just put it in their text document, and it was exfiltrated by the attacker.
That's that we can tell. Correct. Yeah. It was stored. The master password was stored in a text file. Yes, of course. That's the worst possible practice that you could have as an administrator. But whatever. What are you going to do? And along with a lot of other credentials that were very critical. And we did just see that, the LastPass one, and one instance. We did not see it, right?
It wasn't a widespread compromise. It was a one-off.
But just to give you the sense of how deep they were in on these things. Usernames and passwords from tons of places. All right, we got a follow-up. You said GoDaddy was hacked. Does it mean all websites say GoDaddy? No, their GoDaddy credentials were hacked. So in other words, they could log in as that company into GoDaddy and change the details of any of the properties inside GoDaddy, so all the domains or forwarding or, so who knows? One day all of a sudden that company's website gets hacked up or defaced and everybody's like, wow, how did they get in? Well, they just got into GoDaddy with creds and they changed the forwarding to their website versus somebody else's or something like that. All right, so just a large amount of credentials at an oil company, which you can kind of see here. This also came out publicly after us, so we did not source or talk about any of the victim names, but the same data set had been discovered by another researcher who named them out here as an oil company in Kuwait. Airport and airline crew credentials, that was really disturbing given my background in airplane safety, and also network configuration files. Basically had owned just every router, switch, network authentication mechanism in these airports, and it was quite disturbing. SNMP credentials at major energy companies. These are just kind of simple examples to get you guys giving a sense of where they were at and how deep. So the IOCs, they're all in the Appendix A. Please take every single one of those. Try and investigate inside your own organizations for all these IPs. Going outbound, all of these mutexes, all of these service names, installed services, as well as the domains on your DNS logs. I know it is incredibly painful, but also the hashes for all the samples, that would be one of the easiest ways. Simply query all your endpoints for the presence of those hashes. That'll at least indicate a past event, if not a current event, and potentially preventing a future event if you haven't already been victimized.
Oh, and if you detect any of these, we would really appreciate if you'd reach out to us so we could get some more information about this campaign, and we'd be very...
Yeah, we're very grateful, obviously. The more that we can triangulate a number of different disparate, potentially disparate attacks and campaigns, we can tie them together with the same team and get a better scope on what they're able to do. All right, so, their technical abilities have been evolving quickly. We've seen that. And we've seen them now targeting critical infrastructure, again, for what purposes? I don't know how you get this deep in these organizations without some other purpose. I mean, if you just want to exfiltrate data, you just get to the Active Directory tree and you just download everything. You don't go after router configs, switch configs, bypass authentication techniques like VPN credentials. I mean, the whole bloody infrastructure in many of these organizations were owned. And, honestly, it was just the sheer breadth, the depth of targeting, et cetera, that convinced us, along with their progression in their skills, that they are actively involved in executing attacks against these critical infrastructure. And there are many, many more victims that we are just not privy to. So with that final slide, resources, you can obviously download the report. We do have a Cylance blog, which we've done 1 or 2 posts on post-Cleaver. Yeah. One is the notepad bit, which is cool.
Yeah, Derek did a really good write-up on the malicious notepads that we saw, which were actually presumably generated with MSF Venom, which is a tool from the Metasploit framework.
Okay. And Twitter follow-up, of course, Cylance Inc., also Hacking Exposed. If you do have any information additional, you can send it to opcleaver@cylance.com. Please do. We have VR rules as well on cylance.com, but also in the report. And, of course, our technology, which was designed specifically to prevent these kinds of attacks and all future variants of these kinds of attacks, which did amazingly well, as we would have predicted, in finding and preventing all of these hashes that were found in Operation Cleaver before they were seen. This can all be, you can check that out on Cylance.com. All right, with that, we'll just wrap up with a few questions in Q&A. If you have any questions, I'll try and get to every single one of them here for Brian and myself. All right, so you have like a couple of funny questions or interesting ones, and then so what's the scoop on the Forefront UI? Well, what we found on Forefront was they actually had owned an administrator account and had logged into the Forefront threat gateway console, so they could literally change configuration. They could perform anything that a normal administrator could. So in other words, they could make the whole security infrastructure blind to their attacks. Let's see here. We also had one in the beginning from Michael. Why would you give credit to the actors by using the name they choose? It's always, this is a philosophical thing in terms of what you name them. We try to associate it with something that we found in there that didn't seem to be kind of overtly purpose-driven by them. Given that there were a lot of Persian names and Persian words, we certainly could have called him Tar Andishan. Our original name was Parvez because he was pretty active. But at the end of the day, we just went back to the simple decision that was the namespace, that's the project.
The name of the operation is Cleaver, but the internal working name for the group would be Joupen. And that's often what others are referring to this group as.
Yeah, Joupen, Joupen, if you're French, Joupin, I don't know.
Using that name allows the intelligence community to easily share information about this group and be able to identify it fairly simply.
Right. All right, so a couple questions on ICS and SCADA. So any witnessed ICS SCADA targeting in 2014? We certainly witnessed compromising of ICS and SCADA networks. However, they were not, in those particular cases, they were not current customers of ours, so we did not have full access onto the systems on those networks. So we could not confirm definitively that those systems had been compromised, but we could confirm that the networks had been compromised. So hopefully that helps you a little bit. That's also why we're pleading to those folks grabbing the IOCs and looking into their infrastructure, and if they do see more victimization, new tools, new techniques, new vectors of attack, please reach out to us and let us know. Let's see. Okay, these exploits seem pretty similar to the majority that have been found for quite some time. SQL injection, yes. Would the best first line of defense just be to block IPs from these blocks? Well, the problem is, if you just block, activity from these blocks, you certainly can, but it is like shoveling sand against the tide, right?
Yeah, it would take very little effort for them to just jump on Tor or proxies. Or
I mean, they were lazy in many parts, but they got smarter in this campaign. They used more and more techniques, more anonymity techniques, and that showed us that they were willing and able to advance themselves quickly and kind of get over their laziness. Probably because they had been going for so long and never really been popped whatsoever until we had come along. So I would say it's just not the best practice. If you have to do it immediately, then fine, but I would just say longer term you want to look for the techniques themselves, using the R rules, the leftover remnants of the samples and the artifacts that are left behind to see, and also prevent those executables, those hashes, from ever executing. I mean, obviously that's what Cylance Protect does mathematically and algorithmically, but there's also whitelisting solutions that you can try and configure if you have those already, where those specific hashes. The problem is, like we just saw this week, right? You sign that hash with something, with another cert, a private cert, like in the Sony case, and you get a whole new hash. And so it's just like shoveling sand against the tide, right?
Really what you want to be focusing on is defense in depth. If you're relying on one method to avoid being compromised, you're really you're behind the curve there. You need to watch for initial compromises, and then you need to avoid pivoting, and then you also need to watch information leaving your network to make sure it's not important information.
All right, with that said, I know we're over time. Thank you everybody for joining us, and please take a look. We will be putting out a few more webinars here even over the holidays, so if you guys get bored of shopping, please